This is the kind of case that makes celebrity headlines stop feeling like headlines and start feeling like a horror file. Because every time this story comes back into court, the picture gets darker, the timeline gets uglier, and the gap between public image and alleged private reality gets even harder to process. What made D4vd a breakout star was how fast everything moved: viral records, massive streaming numbers, festival stages, a career that looked like it had all the momentum in the world. But what prosecutors are now laying out in court is the exact opposite of the glossy version people knew. They are arguing that behind the success was a hidden relationship with a girl they say he met when she was 11, allegedly began abusing when she was 13, and later killed when she threatened to expose him. D4vd has pleaded not guilty, and his lawyers say he is innocent. But the reason this hearing has shaken so many people is that the court is no longer dealing in vague internet whispers. It is dealing in texts, photos, forensic testimony, and a timeline that prosecutors say tells a devastating story. And that is why this hearing matters so much. This is not just a scandal recap. This is the stage where prosecutors show the judge whether they have enough to take D4vd to a full trial on charges including murder, continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14, and unlawful mutilation of human remains. By the end of the hearing, the judge ruled there was enough evidence to move the case forward, ordered D4vd held without bail, and set the path toward trial. So in this script, we need to walk through what the court heard, why each piece of evidence hit as hard as it did, how prosecutors are building motive, where the defense is pushing back, and why this has become one of the most disturbing celebrity criminal cases in recent memory. Because if you only caught the headlines, you missed the part that is truly haunting here. The case against D4vd is being built not only around physical evidence, but around digital evidence that prosecutors say preserved the relationship, the secrecy, the tension, and the alleged countdown to catastrophe. To understand why people are reacting so strongly, you have to start with the timeline prosecutors presented. According to reporting on the hearing, iCloud data recovered from D4vd's phone showed texts between him and Celeste Rivas Hernandez dating back to August 8, 2022, when she was 11 and he was 17. Prosecutors have said D4vd met Celeste online when she was 11 and that the sexual abuse they allege began when she was 13 and he was 18. That timeline alone is enough to change the entire way the public sees the case, because it suggests a relationship prosecutors say stretched across years, not weeks, and a pattern they argue was hidden while D4vd's profile kept rising. In other words, the court was not hearing about a sudden encounter or a one-off contact. Prosecutors were describing what they say was a prolonged secret relationship developing in parallel with a fast-growing music career. D4vd's lawyers, on the other side, have previously pointed to his denials and argued the murder evidence is insufficient, but the prosecution's narrative begins with duration, not spontaneity. Then came the evidence that pushed the hearing from shocking to almost unbearable. Prosecutors and Detective Corey Farrell described photos recovered from D4vd's seized iPhone, including images of Celeste and more than 36 explicit photos that could not be shown in court because they depicted sexual abuse. AP reported that Celeste was 13 and 14 in those images. The court also heard about ordinary-looking photos that carried a crushing emotional weight, the two kissing, the two lying in bed, and images showing that Celeste had D4vd's name tattooed in red ink on a finger. That detail landed especially hard because one of those fingers had been cut off when her body was found. In court, Celeste's mother began crying as the detective described the images, and both parents left the courtroom. That reaction said a lot about what this hearing really was. This was not celebrity gossip theater. This was a family hearing details of a child's alleged abuse and death in public, piece by piece, while the legal system tried to determine whether the evidence justified a trial. And once the court moved from images to text messages, the prosecution's motive theory came into focus. AP, BBC, and NME all reported on messages shown in court indicating that Celeste became pregnant at age 13 and had an abortion more than a year before she was killed. In an exchange from early January 2024, D4vd apologized for putting her through this. She replied that neither of them were capable of taking care of the baby and that it was for the best. He later asked if the baby was his, and she responded, "Of course it's yours, David." Another text cited by prosecutors had D4vd writing in June 2024, "Let's let this abortion be the last one till we have the real one." Those are the kinds of messages that do two things at once in a courtroom: they place the relationship in concrete terms, and they make the alleged abuse impossible to write off as rumor. D4vd denies the charges, but the prosecution is clearly using the texts to argue that the relationship was intimate, ongoing, and documented in D4vd's own digital records. And this is where the case becomes larger than one horrifying headline. Because a pregnancy at 13 is not just another grim detail. It radically changes how a jury could later understand the relationship prosecutors say existed, and it deepens the prosecution's argument that D4vd had a serious motive to keep the relationship hidden. According to AP, the text conversations often discussed contraception and pregnancy. Months after the abortion, Celeste reportedly texted that she regretted taking an innocent life of a literal baby. In another exchange, she asked whether anyone knew they were having sex, and D4vd allegedly replied, "Nope, and I want to keep it that way until we married." If prosecutors can persuade a jury that those texts are authentic and that they reflect a real ongoing sexual relationship with a child, then they are not just presenting bad optics for D4vd. They are presenting a hidden world of coercion, secrecy, and future promises that prosecutors say collapsed when Celeste became a threat to his career. That is the emotional core of the prosecution's story, and it is the part that makes the case feel so explosive. There was another phrase that stood out from the hearing because it sounded almost surreal against the brutality of the allegations. Prosecutors said D4vd's phone also showed conversations about moving in together, something the pair had dubbed Operation Awesome. Think about how chilling that phrase becomes once you place it inside the prosecution's broader narrative. On the surface, it sounds playful, private, almost childish. In court, though, it takes on a much darker meaning because prosecutors are presenting it as evidence of a long, concealed relationship between a rising adult artist and a minor. BBC reported that the two also discussed moving in together in messages, and AP said she later traveled with D4vd to London and Texas to meet members of his family after turning 14 in September 2024. That matters because it makes the alleged relationship feel more embedded, more normalized, and less easy to explain away as something hidden from everyone at every moment. It raises the kind of question that often hangs over cases like this: who knew what, when, and how much of this could have been seen from the outside? But the hearing did not just focus on the relationship. It also focused on the rupture. AP reported that after Celeste turned 14, the messages showed tension growing between them. In one November 2024 text, she reportedly wrote, "I literally had sex with you for almost a year straight." He allegedly answered that she was acting like it was their first breakup when it was their eighth. That exchange is important because it shows prosecutors are not presenting a static relationship. They are presenting a deteriorating one. They want the court to see a shift from secrecy and promises to instability, conflict, and emotional fallout. Earlier court reporting also said prosecutors had alleged that Celeste threatened to expose the relationship and end your career and your life shortly before her death. When you line those pieces up, the prosecution's theory becomes clearer: years of secret contact, evidence of sexual abuse, pregnancy, emotional conflict, and then, prosecutors say, a motive to silence the person who could destroy D4vd's public life. That brings us to the date prosecutors say everything changed. Authorities said D4vd sent a car to pick up Celeste on April 23, 2025, from Lake Elsinore, about 80 miles outside Los Angeles. According to AP, the two exchanged messages until she arrived at his home, and then her phone went permanently silent. That detail is one of the most haunting in the entire case because it creates a clean before and after line. Before arriving, there is communication. After arrival, nothing. Prosecutors have said Celeste was last seen at D4vd's home and that she was reported missing in April 2025. Her body was not found until September 8, 2025, in the front trunk of a Tesla registered to D4vd, the day after what would have been her 15th birthday. That date carries enormous emotional force. AP even noted a courtroom exchange where the prosecutor asked the medical examiner, "She didn't make it to her 15th birthday, correct?" And he answered, "Correct." In a case already packed with hard facts, that one lands like a verdict on lost time. The condition of Celeste's remains added another layer of horror, and it also created one of the central battlegrounds for the defense. Dr. Grant Ho, the Los Angeles County medical examiner who conducted the post-mortem examination, testified that it was extremely difficult to tell exactly when Celeste died because of the state of decomposition. He said she had been dead for at least weeks and possibly months. He identified 2 sharp force injuries to her upper body as potential fatal wounds, including one abdominal wound that penetrated the liver and another in the left chest that damaged ribs. At the same time, he could not determine everything cleanly because of how degraded the body was when it was found. That uncertainty gave the defense room to attack the murder theory. D4vd's lawyers emphasized that the toxicology results were limited and that decomposition could affect testing. They also questioned whether the evidence truly established a deliberate intent to kill. In other words, the prosecution used the autopsy to support homicide, while the defense used the gaps in certainty to argue that murder was not proven. But if the autopsy had uncertainties, the prosecution's physical evidence story was aimed at reducing those uncertainties somewhere else. Prosecutors previously alleged that D4vd bought chainsaws, an inflatable pool, a shovel, and other items online after Celeste's death. AP reported that records showed he ordered chainsaws and wading pools that prosecutors say were used to dismember her body in his garage. During the hearing, a police analyst also testified that samples pulled from apparent blood stains there matched Celeste's DNA. Other reporting described blood found in the Tesla and the garage as well. This is crucial because it gives prosecutors something jurors tend to understand intuitively, a movement from digital evidence to physical evidence. The texts and photos tell the story of the relationship. The alleged purchases, the DNA, and the Tesla tell the story of what prosecutors say happened at the end. The state is trying to create one continuous chain, from secret contact to fatal violence to concealment. D4vd's side says he did not murder Celeste. The prosecution says the evidence fits together too tightly to be coincidence. And then there is the front trunk of the Tesla. Few details in this case are as symbolically damaging as that. According to AP, Celeste's body was discovered in the trunk of a Tesla registered to D4vd after the vehicle had been towed and impounded. BBC described the remains as having been found in the front boot of his Tesla. The image is devastating because it collapses distance. This was not evidence found somewhere abstract and disconnected. Prosecutors say the remains of a 14-year-old girl were found inside a vehicle linked directly to D4vd. That is why every procedural development in this case has carried such intensity. People do not hear "rising singer charged" and stop there. They hear "body found in his Tesla," DNA in the garage, chainsaw purchases, and texts about pregnancy, and suddenly the case starts to feel less like celebrity news and more like a prosecution memo unfolding in public. Legally, that still has to be tested at trial. Emotionally, it already explains why the case has generated such a fierce reaction. The tattoo evidence, while not the biggest piece in legal terms, may become one of the most unforgettable pieces for a future jury. AP reported that images shown in court included Celeste with D4vd's name tattooed in red ink on her finger. Another article described related shoe tattoos on their index fingers. On paper, tattoos can be introduced as relationship evidence. In the courtroom, though, they operate on another level. They suggest possession, permanence, secrecy, and emotional enmeshment. They visually reinforce the prosecution's claim that this was not a misunderstanding or a fabricated connection, but a real and sustained relationship. When that detail is paired with the messages about keeping the sexual relationship secret until marriage, the prosecution gains something powerful, not just evidence of contact, but evidence of psychological entanglement. It paints D4vd, in the prosecution's telling, as someone allegedly building a private world with a child while publicly living as a successful young artist. And when the public hears details like that, the reaction is not just disbelief. It is revulsion at how ordinary relationship markers can look so sinister when the ages and power imbalance are placed back into view. The prosecution also benefited from the broader contrast between D4vd's career trajectory and the private timeline they laid out. AP noted that under the name D4vd, he became an online musical phenomenon as a teenager, with major streaming success and huge visibility on TikTok, SoundCloud, and Spotify. He opened for SZA, played Coachella, and released his first full-length album, Withered, 2 days after prosecutors say Celeste was killed. That sequence is narratively brutal. The state does not need to say much more once those dates are placed side by side. A career climbing publicly. A secret relationship prosecutors say was becoming volatile privately. An alleged killing. Then an album release. Those juxtapositions matter because juries are made of human beings, and human beings understand what it means when one person's ascent is allegedly built next to another person's erasure. D4vd is presumed innocent until proven guilty in court. But the prosecution is clearly aware that the timeline itself carries moral weight, and every hearing day has made that contrast harder for the public to ignore. Now, one of the most important questions in any case like this is whether the prosecution can explain motive without overreaching. Here, prosecutors have repeatedly said they believe D4vd killed Celeste after she threatened to reveal the relationship and destroy his career. AP reported that the state is seeking to prove he stabbed her to death when she threatened to expose their long sexual history and crater a career that had earned him millions. That theory works because it connects directly to the evidence the prosecution has emphasized: the secrecy in the texts, the pregnancy, the regret, the arguments, the breakup cycle, and the final messages. It gives the case a terrible internal logic. If the relationship was hidden, and if exposure would have been catastrophic, then prosecutors want the judge and eventually a jury to see violence as the alleged method of permanent control. The defense, of course, does not accept that. D4vd's lawyers have argued there is no evidence he harbored deliberate intent to kill Celeste and have pointed to the absence of a documented history of violence in the messages. That fight over intent is going to matter enormously at trial. The defense position is worth slowing down for, because it is easy in a case this emotional to flatten the legal complexity. According to AP, defense attorney Marilyn Bednarski argued there was no evidence that D4vd harbored a deliberate intent to kill Celeste and said the communications showed no threat, no evidence of a history of violence, and the opposite of homicidal malice. The defense also highlighted that Celeste had asked multiple times to see D4vd before her death and that she had threatened to kill and mutilate him. That does not erase the prosecution's evidence. It does show where the defense believes it can create reasonable doubt, especially on the murder count. Their strategy appears to be twofold: first, resist the idea that the state has proven a premeditated or malicious killing; second, exploit the limits created by decomposition and toxicology uncertainty. In other words, while the public reaction has focused on the most graphic and shocking elements, the legal battle is likely to turn on whether the jury believes the prosecution has closed every critical gap between suspicion, concealment, and homicidal intent. Even so, the reason the judge's ruling mattered is that those defense arguments were not enough to stop the case from moving forward. AP reported that Judge Charlene Olmedo found probable cause for trial on charges including murder, continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14, and unlawful mutilation of human remains. She ordered D4vd held without bail. That is not a finding of guilt, but it is a significant procedural win for the state. It means the judge concluded the prosecution had presented enough evidence to justify putting the case before a jury. For the public, that ruling changed the tone of the conversation. Before, there were accusations, filings, and hearings. After the ruling, there was a judicial determination that the evidence crossed the threshold needed for trial. In a celebrity case, that distinction matters because fame often creates a parallel conversation where people assume smoke does or does not mean fire. Here, the court effectively said the evidence deserves full examination before a jury. That is a serious moment in any criminal case, and in this one, it landed like confirmation that the story was not collapsing under scrutiny. What makes the D4vd case so uniquely disturbing, though, is not only the allegation of murder. It is the layering. The prosecution is not presenting a single terrible act in isolation. It is presenting what it says was a chain of conduct: contact beginning when Celeste was 11, sexual abuse beginning when she was 13, intimate messages, pregnancy, abortion, plans to move in together, trips to meet family, repeated breakups, alleged threats of exposure, an alleged killing, alleged dismemberment, and then concealment of the body. Each layer changes the emotional texture of the one before it. The more the court hears, the less room there is for the public to compartmentalize the case. If it were only a missing person mystery, people would respond one way. If it were only a child abuse case, they would respond another. If it were only a murder case, another. But the prosecution's narrative combines all of those categories, and that is why every hearing day seems to intensify the reaction rather than exhaust it. Another reason the case keeps cutting through the noise is that it feels like the opposite of a random collapse. Prosecutors are framing D4vd not as someone overtaken by sudden chaos, but as someone who, they allege, used planning and concealment repeatedly. The alleged online purchases fit that theory. The secrecy in the messages fits that theory. The way prosecutors have described the relationship fits that theory. Even phrases like "Operation Awesome," innocent on their face, start sounding sinister when placed next to the rest of the record. A lot of criminal cases hinge on whether the prosecution can show a coherent narrative rather than a pile of bad facts. In the D4vd case, coherence may be one of the state's strongest weapons. The messages are not being offered as random ugliness. They are being woven into a timeline of grooming, control, risk, and alleged elimination of that risk. That is why this case has been so difficult to watch. The prosecution is not just describing alleged acts. It is describing, step by step, an alleged system. There is also a wider cultural reason people are locked in on this case. D4vd was young enough, recent enough, and digitally native enough that his rise felt contemporary to a lot of his audience. This is not a story about a decades-old icon facing allegations from a distant era. It is a story about a modern streaming artist whose career bloomed in the same online ecosystem where fans track drops, clips, tour footage, and personality in real time. That makes the dissonance sharper. Fans are not comparing old myths to new evidence. They are comparing a version of D4vd they remember seeing online with the evidence now entering court. And because that evidence includes intimate texts and iCloud records, the case feels native to the era in a way that is especially unsettling. It is a reminder that digital life does not just build celebrity now. It can also preserve the record prosecutors used to tear that celebrity apart. One of the most devastating details from the hearing was not even a graphic exhibit. It was the way ordinary teenage milestones kept appearing in the story as lost markers. Celeste turned 14 in September 2024. She would have turned 15 the day before her body was found. Her parents were in court listening to descriptions of photos they should never have had to imagine. She was discussed in messages about moving in together, in messages about pregnancy, in messages about breakups, and in messages prosecutors say showed a secret sexual relationship continuing across months. Cases involving children often horrify people because they force adults to confront stolen time. The D4vd case does that repeatedly. Every timestamp in the prosecution's narrative doubles as a reminder of how young Celeste was at each step. 11. 13. 14. Almost 15. Those numbers are not background details. They are the moral frame around the entire case. And because those ages are so central, the hearing has also reignited an old public argument about what counts as obvious knowledge in a hidden relationship. D4vd has previously told police, according to reporting, that he did not know Celeste was a minor and had only met her once in person. But prosecutors presented texts dating back years, discussed travel with her, and introduced evidence they say directly contradicts the idea that he did not understand who she was. That contradiction matters because it goes to credibility. In a courtroom, once jurors believe a defendant lied about one major fact, everything else becomes harder to sell. D4vd's defense will still have every opportunity to challenge the state's interpretation of the records. But if the jury later concludes that the evidence shows he knew Celeste's age and the relationship was exactly what prosecutors say it was, then his prior denials may not look like confusion. They may look like consciousness of guilt. That is one reason the hearing was so consequential beyond the procedural ruling. Another major factor is the role of silence. Cases like this are often remembered not only for what was said, but for what stopped being said. AP reported that authorities said Celeste and D4vd exchanged messages until she arrived at his home, after which her phone went dead. That silence is doing a lot of work in the prosecution story. It marks the point where the relationship, as documented in the phone records, ends and the missing person phase begins. It also gives the jury a clean transition from interpersonal evidence to forensic evidence. Before silence, texts, promises, conflict, secrecy. After silence, disappearance, decomposition, DNA, autopsy, alleged purchase records. In narrative terms, that is devastating. In legal terms, it is efficient. It helps the prosecution turn a sprawling relationship history into a sharply focused timeline centered on one final day. That is the kind of compression that often makes a case feel persuasive to a jury. At the same time, the defense will likely keep trying to widen the frame. If they can make the medical evidence look uncertain, the timeline look less exact, or the emotional conflict between the two look more mutual and chaotic, then they may be able to argue that the prosecution is relying too heavily on discuss to close legal gaps. That will probably be one of the deepest tensions at trial. The prosecution's evidence is powerful because it feels cumulative. The defense's hope is probably that jurors will separate emotional power from proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That is much easier said than done when the exhibits include a child's explicit photos, pregnancy texts, and DNA evidence tied to the defendant's property and vehicle. But criminal trials are not decided by horror alone. They are decided by whether the jury thinks the state's theory is not just plausible, but proven. That is the space D4vd's lawyers will fight to occupy. Still, even if you strip away the emotional language and look at the case as coldly as possible, the reason people keep saying the hearing changed everything is simple: the public now has a far more concrete sense of what prosecutors believe they can prove. Before these court days, the story existed for many people as fragments. A famous name. A missing girl. A body in a car. A denial. But the hearing connected the fragments. It linked D4vd to messages spanning years. It linked the relationship to pregnancy and abortion. It linked the alleged motive to threats of exposure. It linked the home to blood evidence. It linked the Tesla to the body. And it linked the case procedurally to a future trial. That is why the mood shifted so sharply. The hearing did not end the case. It gave it structure. And once a case like this has structure, it starts living in the public mind differently. It stops sounding like rumor and starts sounding like a countdown to a jury reckoning. There is also a reputational dimension here that cannot be separated from the criminal allegations. D4vd's public image was built on youth, talent, and momentum. A lot of listeners discovered him through songs that thrived in the emotional, internet-native space where vulnerability sells. What the prosecution is presenting is a radically different emotional reality: private secrecy, alleged predation, and an alleged act of fatal violence against a child. That contradiction is part of why the story keeps detonating online whenever there is a new development. The public is not just reacting to the accusations themselves. It is reacting to the collapse of the persona attached to the name D4vd. In celebrity cases, that collapse often becomes part of the spectacle. Here, it is hard to even call it spectacle without feeling like the word is too shallow. The human cost is too visible, and the courtroom details are too severe. What happens next is equally important. Because now that the judge has found probable cause and sent the case toward trial, the prosecution will be preparing to present the full narrative to jurors, and the defense will be preparing to attack every link in that chain. Expect battles over digital evidence authentication, over how the texts are interpreted, over what the medical examiner could and could not determine, over the meaning of the alleged purchases, and over whether the state can prove intent to kill rather than only concealment after death. Expect the defense to keep saying D4vd did not murder Celeste. Expect the prosecution to keep arguing that the evidence shows not only murder, but years of abuse and a final violent act triggered by the threat of exposure. And expect public interest to intensify, not fade, because once a judge sends a case like this to trial, people start waiting for the one thing hearings do not deliver: a jury's answer. The hardest part of all this is that there may never be a version of this story that feels emotionally proportional to what Celeste lost. Legal proceedings can establish charges, admissibility, timelines, and verdicts. They cannot restore a 14-year-old's future. They cannot undo the reality that her parents sat in court while detectives described explicit images of their child. They cannot soften the cruelty of the birthday detail, or the shock of the pregnancy texts, or the ugliness of prosecutors describing alleged dismemberment in a garage. Whether D4vd is ultimately convicted or acquitted will determine the criminal outcome. But the hearing already established something much broader in the public imagination: this is not a celebrity controversy that can be waved away as chaos around fame. It is a child death case tied to one of the most disturbing fact patterns the music world has seen in years. And that is why this story is not going away. Not because the internet loves scandal, though it does. Not because celebrity cases automatically dominate attention, though they often do. This case is staying in focus because the allegations against D4vd are so severe, the evidence described in court is so concrete, and the emotional stakes are so impossible to ignore. Every new court day has brought another piece of a story prosecutors say began when Celeste was a child and ended with her body hidden in a car linked to D4vd. He says he is innocent. His lawyers say the state cannot prove murder. The judge has now said the evidence is enough to move to trial. That is where things stand, and that is why the next phase could be even more consequential than what we have already seen. So the question now is not whether this case is serious. That part is over. The question is which side can make its story survive the pressure of a full jury trial. Can prosecutors take the texts, the photos, the alleged purchases, the autopsy findings, the DNA evidence, and the silence after April 23 and turn them into proof beyond a reasonable doubt against D4vd? Or can the defense convince jurors that however disturbing the case looks, the state still has not definitively proven homicidal intent and unlawful responsibility for Celeste's death? That is the battlefield ahead. And if this case keeps producing the kind of courtroom revelations we have already seen, then the trial involving D4vd, Celeste Rivas Hernandez, and the evidence now in the record may become one of the most closely watched celebrity criminal proceedings in the country. Because at this point, the headlines are no longer doing justice to what the hearing exposed. This is not just the story of D4vd the artist. It is the story of D4vd the defendant, D4vd in the texts, D4vd in the alleged timeline prosecutors built, and D4vd facing a case that now carries the full weight of a pending murder trial. And when a court record starts pulling back that many layers at once, the public does not simply move on. It keeps watching, because it wants to know whether the evidence will hold, whether the contradictions will crack, whether the defense can puncture the state's theory, and whether justice for Celeste will ultimately come in the form of a conviction, an acquittal, or a verdict that leaves the world still arguing over what happened behind closed doors. That is why this case has become so haunting. And that is why the trial ahead may hit even harder than the hearing that brought us here. If you have been following this case, tell me where you think the decisive battle will be. Do prosecutors already have a narrative strong enough to overwhelm the defense, or do you think the unanswered medical questions give D4vd a real path to reasonable doubt? And beyond the courtroom, what part of the hearing hit you hardest? The age timeline, the pregnancy texts, the alleged purchases, the Tesla, or the fact that Celeste's family had to sit through all of this in open court? Because what keeps making this case feel heavier is that the prosecution is not relying on one sensational point. It is relying on accumulation. One hearing day gives you the text messages. Another gives you the forensic testimony. Another gives you the alleged purchase trail. Another gives you the emotional deterioration between D4vd and Celeste. And by the time you step back and look at the entire picture, it starts to feel like prosecutors are trying to remove every escape hatch one by one. If the relationship is documented, the denial looks weaker. If the pregnancy is documented, the stakes look higher. If the breakup tension is documented, the motive looks clearer. If the garage and Tesla are tied to Celeste through forensic evidence, then the defense has to do more than say the case is ugly. It has to explain why the ugliest facts point where they do while still not proving murder beyond a reasonable doubt. That is a brutal legal position to be in, and it is exactly why so many people believe the trial could become even more damaging for D4vd than the preliminary hearing already was. And there is one more uncomfortable reality hanging over everything. Cases like this do not just test the prosecution and the defense. They also test the people around the central figure. Whenever prosecutors lay out years of alleged contact, travel, family introductions, emotional entanglement, and repeated communication, the public immediately begins asking whether there were missed warning signs, ignored red flags, or people who saw enough to know something was wrong. That does not automatically make other people criminally liable, and the hearing itself was focused on D4vd. But socially, morally, and culturally, those questions are unavoidable. They always are in cases where an alleged secret relationship lasted long enough to create a timeline instead of a moment. And that is one more reason this story keeps getting bigger every time it comes back to court. People are not only asking what D4vd allegedly did. They are asking how a situation like this could continue long enough to end in a murder case. However you see it, one reality is impossible to miss now. The D4vd case is no longer a loose collection of allegations. It is an advancing prosecution with a judge-approved path to trial, and the next chapter may be the one that finally determines how this story will be remembered. If prosecutors can make the digital trail, the alleged motive, and the forensic record locked together in front of a jury, then D4vd may be facing the kind of collapse no career can survive. If the defense can separate horror from proof and force jurors to dwell inside every unanswered question, then the final outcome could look more complicated than public opinion expects. Either way, Celeste Rivas Hernandez remains at the center of all of it, and that is the part no one should let celebrity framing erase. This is not ultimately about brand damage or industry fallout. It is about a 14-year-old girl, a courtroom full of evidence, and a trial that may decide whether prosecutors truly prove that D4vd turned secrecy, fear, and exposure into fatal violence. And if this case keeps unfolding the way it has so far, the verdict will not just answer what happens to D4vd. It will shape how people remember Celeste, how they judge everyone who looked away, and how the music world talks about one of its darkest modern prosecutions for years to come.